All right, I think everyone who is joining us live here is here. And I'd like to officially welcome you all, Jai Jinendra, and welcome to Arihanta Institute's Voices in Compassion Studies speaker series. This is our first one, and we're very delighted that you're here today. Let's see, our first presentation is with Dr. Jeffrey Long, and it is titled Compassionate Speech, Anekāntavāda as an Antidote to Polarization. So I'm Deanna Hewlett, the academic project coordinator and a graduate student here at Arihanta Institute. I'll be your co-host for the series along with Christopher Jane Miller, who's our vice president of academic affairs here at Arihanta Institute. So before I pass it along to Dr. Miller to introduce Dr. Long, I'd like to share a few logistical details. So Dr. Long's presentation is going to go for approximately 35 to 40 minutes. And afterwards, we'll have plenty of time for questions. So the Zoom Q&A feature, which should be at the bottom of your taskbar, will be open throughout the entire presentation. So as your questions arise, please feel free to put them in there. We'll definitely make note of them, and Dr. Miller will moderate the Q&A as the time comes. So we really hope that you enjoy Dr. Long's presentation, and I will pass it on to Chris.
Jai Janendra, thank you so much, Diana, and thank you so much, of course, to Professor Long for being here, as well as our audience and attendees who came to join us here for the launch of this Voices in Compassion Studies speaker series, which is also part of the launch in 2025 of the Compassion Studies Initiative, which is supported with the generosity of a grant from the Uberoi Foundation for Religious Studies. We are deeply appreciative of the support from the Uberoi Foundation. And I have the great pleasure today of introducing our speaker, Professor Dr. Jeffrey Long. So Dr. Jeffrey D. Long is the Carl W. Zeigler Professor of Religion, Philosophy, and Asian Studies at Elizabethtown College in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, where he's taught since receiving his PhD from the University of Chicago Divinity School in the year 2000. He is the author, editor, or co-editor of 12 books, including Hinduism in America, A Convergence of Worlds, which won the Rajinder and Jyoti Gandhi Award for Excellence in Theology, Philosophy, and Critical Reflection from the Dharma Academy of North America in 2022. His latest book is Discovering Indian Philosophy, An Introduction to Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist Thought. His work focuses primarily on the religions and philosophies of India, mainly the Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist traditions, and on such themes as nonviolence, pluralism, and its metaphysical foundations, the pedagogy of teaching Indic traditions in a Western context, religion and popular culture, and the concept of rebirth. In 2021, he received an award from the International Ahimsa Foundation for his efforts to promote nonviolence through scholarship. In the same year, he received the Ranck Award for Research Excellence from Elizabethtown College. He has spoken 3 times at the United Nations and appears in documentaries for PBS and the History Channel. I'm really honored to have you here to give this first talk, Professor Long. We've worked together, we've been colleagues for a while, and it's a great honor to work with you once again as you are today going to present us, as Diana mentioned, Compassionate Speech, Anekāntavāda as an Antidote to Polarization. With that being said, Dr. Long, I will now hand the floor over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Christopher and Diana and Judge Indra. And it is my honor and privilege to be here with the two of you and with everyone who's joining us. I'm honored to be kicking off this series for Arihanta Institute. And I have worked with Arihanta Institute before, and it's a wonderful way to disseminate Jain wisdom to the world. And so, without further ado, I'll get into my topic, which, as Christopher, as you have said, is compassionate speech. Anekāntavāda is an antidote to polarization. I think we're all very familiar with polarization. This is something that has become really almost a feature of political and cultural, religious, social, all kinds of discourse in the Western world, but really globally too. I was recently in India, and India is every bit as polarized as the U.S. When I say polarization, I'm not simply referring to disagreement, because disagreement's just part of life, right? We all see things from our point of view, from our particular understanding. Polarization is something I think much more problematic, where not only do we disagree with others, but we decide that they are therefore not worthy of human dignity, right? That they're not worthy to really be engaged seriously, that they're to be insulted, demeaned. All kinds of people come up with all kinds of clever names for the other side, and so on. And this becomes a substitute for really serious, thoughtful conversation where we're respectful and learn from each other's differences. And so I think a lot of us are looking for an antidote to this. Is there a way of thinking that could counteract this type of polarization? And the concept of compassion and the practice of compassion is so central to the Jain tradition. I want to speak today about the several concepts, Anekāntavāda and the related concepts of Nāyavāda and Syadvāda, which I think really have great potential to be helpful in this regard. And I'm actually have prepared a course on compassion for the Arihant Institute for its initiative on compassion studies this year. And I'm drawing a great deal of today's presentation from a session of that course where I focus on compassionate speech, but I've expanded upon it a bit here as it's my main topic today. So, Anekāntavāda as an antidote to polarization. What does this mean? So, an essential element of compassion, which could be defined as a practice of empathy rooted in the insight that all beings are interconnected. That's what I mean by compassion, right? Not simply a sentiment, but empathy rooted in the understanding that you and I and all beings are deeply intertwined with one another. An essential element of such compassion is an awareness of the central role that the beliefs and worldviews of people play in their sense of self. We tend to identify very strongly with our particular views, whether they be political, whether they be religious, even if it's a preference about music or sports. This can identify us very strongly in our minds. Even if we find that we disagree strongly with some or even many of the views held by another person, if we want to engage them compassionately, it's vital that we understand why that person believes as they do, right? There's that phrase of, walking in someone else's shoes. And understanding that maybe if we'd had similar experiences to theirs, we ourselves might have a very similar view, even though in our current state we strongly reject all of that. But if we see literally where they're coming from, then this will help us to engage them in a more productive way. It's equally crucial to our own growth as beings on the spiritual path that we remain open to the truths perceived by others, even when those truths appear to conflict with the truths that we perceive ourselves. According to Jain teaching, according to Anekāntavāda, the universe is kind of like this beautiful temple ceiling that you see depicted on the screen below. It is complex. And if we really wish to grasp that full complexity, this means being able to, in some way, adopt and enter into and at least engage deeply with the perspectives of those who are situated differently within that complex reality than we are ourselves. The Jain teaching of the Anekānta, or multifaceted nature of reality, encourages us to practice speech that is compassionate, enabling us to engage with the worldviews of others, not as rivals to our own, right? We have to beat the other side, right? Or as false views. Well, it doesn't agree with me, therefore it must be wrong, right? They have to be refuted, but as potential elements in a wider truth of which we ourselves are only partly aware. Right? To see that, okay, I don't agree with that. That doesn't sound correct to me, but that person is seeing something, and I might not be seeing it. So what might it be? Right? To see difference as an opportunity to investigate more deeply and thereby learn and grow. For all beings who've not attained omniscience, I would say that's the vast majority of anyone who might be listening, including myself, the proper attitude when engaging with the views of others is humility and openness to learning new things, as well as a willingness to share our own insights when these are welcome. Right? That doesn't mean pushing your view, but it can mean when someone says, "Well, what do you think?" Well, then we've been asked to share that, and so that is also a practice of compassion. Anekāntavāda can thus serve as an antidote to the violent and uncompassionate polarization that currently afflicts much human discourse, right? It's a very different way of orienting ourselves to difference than what is often commonplace now. It can open the door to more compassionate and insightful speech and a deeper dialogue across worldviews. So, how can we show compassion in our polarized world? The Jains, I think, have a lot to teach us about this because historically Jains have always been a minority community in India, as far as we can tell. There's some accounts of places where the Jain tradition flourished, particularly in the past. Even today, there are regions of India where Jains are more prominent than in others. But even in places like Gujarat or Karnataka, where you do have larger numbers of Jains, it's still a very small community. It's still a minority surrounded by non-Jain worldviews, people with non-Jain outlooks and ways of life. So this means Jains have had to learn to coexist with people with views that differ from their own and have done so over the course of thousands of years. The challenge in an environment with diverse worldviews is to practice ahimsa, that is nonviolence in thought, word, and action, and daya, compassion, while also being true to one's principles. In other words, there's a bit of a tightrope that one needs to walk to coexist as someone with a minority view in an environment where, people think other things. That is remaining true to your view, true to your truth, right? If we could say it that way, faithful to one's own understanding, and at the same time not thereby becoming insensitive to the views, the truths of others. So this is always the balance. We don't want to be overly aggressive or overly assertive about our perspective because then we're doing the very thing that is prompting a lot of the polarization, right? The people in this cartoon below, this depicts contemporary polarization in America. Right? They're pretty vocal toward each other about their perspectives. But we don't want to be excessive in that regard, or we're just perpetuating the same problem. But this also doesn't mean just kind of, in a sense, sitting back and not affirming any values or any views. There may be cases where we are morally compelled to speak up and to say, no, I have a different perspective, especially if something's going on that we think is very, very morally problematic. So finding that middle path is the challenge. The Jains have developed a way to do this with the philosophy of Anekāntavāda. So, for those who aren't familiar with it, Anekāntavāda is the doctrine of the non-one-sided. That's what Anekanta means. Non-one-sided, Anekanta nature of existence. I'm using Sanskrit terminology, Anekanta, Anekāntavāda. In contemporary languages like Hindi and Gujarati, people would say Anekant or Anekāntavāda. Same idea, just a slightly different way of phrasing it. Anekāntavāda or Anekāntavāda affirms the inherent complexity of the cosmos. It is the opposite of reductionism. That might be called Ekāntavāda, right? The idea of one-sidedness, which seeks to explain all phenomena in terms of a single phenomenon. Now, what's an example of that, right? If we understand reductionism, we can have maybe a better sense of what its opposite might be. Reductionism is something that we find very frequently in both philosophy and science, in which one single principle is used to try to explain everything. And two examples come to mind when we think about the nature of existence. Materialism is a type of reductionism. That is the idea that everything we experience, even consciousness events, are explainable in terms of the interactions of what are inherently non-experiencing or dead pieces of matter. And that is materialism. And of course, it has difficulties, as many philosophers have pointed out. Many people sort of take it as a truism that it's chemicals operating in the brain that give rise to consciousness, but no one's really explained how exactly that happens. So you have contrary points of view. You have, for example, attempts to explain everything in terms of consciousness. Everything is consciousness, everything is awareness, and then the material world is really kind of a dreamlike phenomenon that's a modification of consciousness. And of course, that has difficulties as well, because we find the material causation and mechanistic causation seems to be a very real thing on our day-to-day macro level. So why is it like that? If it's all consciousness, is there some way I can just change it with my mind? That seems reality seems kind of stubborn when it comes to that. Not that maybe some advanced beings might not be able to do it, but there seems to be something we could call the reality of materiality. So, from a Jain perspective, we say, well, both of those things are real. We have consciousness. It's not material, it is somehow distinct. At the same time, there is material causation, and we experience that as well. So, don't try to reduce everything to one phenomenon. This is essentially what the Anekāntavāda is emerging from. For every aspect or facet of an entity that exists, right, if reality is multifaceted, there's a perspective, Naya in Sanskrit, from which it can be viewed. This is called Nayavada, the Jain doctrine of perspectives. That is, there is materiality, so you have what you might call a material perspective, and there is consciousness, so you have what we might call an idealist or consciousness perspective. And those are both valid because they're oriented toward real experiences that make up our phenomenal reality. So Anekāntavāda and Nayavada together have implications for how we should make claims about the nature of reality. If everything is multifaceted, if therefore no one single perspective can really encompass all truth, then when we make assertions, if we really want to be precise, if we want to be philosophical, we need to bring into mind, we need to bear in mind the perspective from which a claim is made. So from one perspective, a claim may be true, right? It could be seen as true. In fact, you could say from one perspective, a claim is true, right? From a certain perspective or way of understanding. Right? In Sanskrit, you say syadasti, right? From a certain perspective, this is the case. But from another perspective, it may also be false, right? Syadnasti. From another point of view, it is not true. And we can combine these. It can also be said to be both true and false, right? Syad asti nasti. Or it may be beyond description. In a sense, we could say neither true nor false. Syad avaktavya, right? This is how it's said in Sanskrit. And then these four can also be combined in various ways. True and beyond description, false and beyond description, true and false and beyond description. These combinations, combined with the first four, make up seven possible values of truth that a claim could have. So this is called Syadvada. Syadvada, Syat in ordinary Sanskrit, it's an optative. It means something like it could be or it may be. But in Jain usage, it means from a certain perspective or point of view. So scholars call this the doctrine of conditional predication, according to which a statement is not absolutely true. It's only true in a certain sense or from a certain point of view. This phrase from a certain point of view has become very popular among Star Wars fans. I've got a picture here from a still from Return of the Jedi. This is a very famous scene in which Obi-Wan Kenobi is explaining to Luke Skywalker that, he had told him that Darth Vader, the bad guy, had killed Luke's father. But then Luke learned that Darth Vader actually was his father, that his father had become Darth Vader. And Obi-Wan explains, well, Darth Vader's not really the same person that your father was. Your father was a good man. He was a good friend. He had certain characteristics. He now has very different characteristics. So, in a sense, he's a different person. So, from a certain point of view, he's not. He's not your father. He's a different being. So this, I feel, is a nice example of Syadvada. Now, one thing I've incorporated into my presentation today is a recent conversation I had the great privilege to have in India. I was traveling in India with a group of students, and we got to meet a Digambar Jain Muni, Digambar Jain Acharya Shrut Sagarji, pictured here. And he talked with us about Syadvada. This was the main focus of his talk with our group. And he defined Syadvada. He used the English word relativity. And I was very pleased to hear this because for quite some time I've been translating Anekāntavāda, Nayavada, and Syadvada collectively as the doctrines of relativity. And I'll explain in a moment what I mean by that. And I've met with some disagreement. I've some scholars say, well, no, that's not really relativity. It's something else. But Shutsagaji said Syadvada is relativity. Now he differentiated it. He said Anekāntavāda is not relativity, it's multiplicity, right? Nayavada is not relativity, it's perspectives. But Syadvada is relativity, he said, meaning the truth of your claim is relative to the perspective from which you make it. This is the sense of that I've always meant by relativity, and I was very pleased to hear a Jain Acharya use this term. I think it validated that understanding. He also said something else which was really fascinating. As I was just describing Syadvada in the previous slide, so there's a sense in which the truth of a statement is beyond description, right? It's avaktavya, it cannot be put into words. And the Muni used this word, Acharya Shutsagaji used this word silence to describe that. He says there's a fourth truth value, which is silence. And I just thought this was incredibly profound, because we think generally of silence as just the absence of speech, but silence can be the effect of perceiving the multiplicity of truth and realizing that no single statement can encompass it. And so silence perhaps is the most appropriate response to certain questions. One thinks of the famous silence of the Buddha, in which he would not answer questions, not because he didn't know the answer or because it was a bad question, but because that was the answer. That was the answer to that question. And Acharya Shutsagaji went on to say that silence is a medicine. And our group found this very captivating because he was basically saying that, in our polarized world, where people disagree deeply and sometimes even violently, there could be there could be many contexts in which the best answer to a contentious question is simply silence. That when we respond to a contentious topic with silence, we have the potential to bring healing to that situation. And as I thought about it more, I realized I've had some experiences of this in my own life where there might be a topic on which a group of people are having a great deal of contention. They're fighting, they're polarized, they're starting to dislike each other because they can't agree on this particular topic. And the person in the room who is silent often ends up being the one that they turn to mediate the conflict because they're seen as impartial. Silence is impartial. You haven't taken a side, right? So there's a great power in silence. And I just wanted to linger on that for a moment because we're interested in compassionate speech. And it could be that there are times that the compassionate thing is to not say anything at all. I'm thinking of other situations of this kind as well. When someone's been traumatized, when someone's had a very bad experience, if we understand karma, if we have a worldview like the Jain worldview, if we sort of see how causation brings about our experiences in this world, it could be very tempting to tell someone, well, this is the effects of your karma working out. If you wait, they'll pass, and if you do other things, you'll have different outcomes. Well, that could be very hurtful to someone who's still in the throes of the trauma of what they're experiencing. And so it may be that the best thing to do at that time is not to say anything, but to listen, to be present to that person and their trauma and to hear what they're saying. And that requires silence. If we're going to hear others, we have to shut up. We have to be silent. We have to let them speak. So I like this idea. Silence is medicine. I think this was a very powerful exchange that my students and I had with Acharya Shutsagaji. It was a great privilege. We take no stand when we adopt silence, but we're open to the perspectives of all. We're listening, right? We're listening. And that itself is healing. That itself is compassion. Um, a brief historical note. I'll just go over this fairly briefly, but the fact that sometimes the question arises historically, how did this idea emerge in the Jain tradition? And scholars have focused on really a multi-causal explanation, very appropriate for Anekāntavāda, right? There's no one single explanation that you can reduce it to. The focus on ahimsa, or nonviolence in thought, word, and action, leads one to be very careful about one's environment, to make distinctions, for example, between living and non-living beings. Um, Mahavir's both and approach, as attested in the Shvetambara canon, to the Avyakta questions, that he would tend to respond to these questions by giving multiple perspectives, multi-perspectival answers, or multi-dimensional answers to these questions, rather than reductionist answers, it's this or it's that. Then you have the wider pluralistic ontology of the Jain tradition, which affirms the irreducibility of the substances making up reality, Jiva, the living soul; Pudgala, matter; Dharma, which in this context is the principle of motion, something like Rajas in the Sankhya tradition; Adharma, the process, or the principle rather, of inertia; Kala, time; Akasha, space. So again, Jain tradition, from its origins, does not try to reduce everything to one thing. There are multiple substances, dravyas, making up reality, according to the Jain tradition. And then, if you look in the authoritative text that's acknowledged by all the various Jain communities, the Tattvartha Sutra says that all of existence involves arising, endurance, and passing away. This is the 30th verse of the 5th chapter of the Tattvartha. And so it's saying that uh, everything that exists has multiple aspects. Even you have these three aspects: the arising aspect, the persistent aspect, and that which passes away. Now, traditionally, Jain thinkers have used Anekāntavāda as a methodology for conceptualizing differences across worldviews, for understanding why people think different things. And this has been illustrated with the very ancient parable of the blind people and the elephant. We see this in the Buddhist and Hindu traditions as well. Each worldview, each perspective is like a different blind person trying to describe the different parts of an elephant. They proceed to disagree with one another because what they're describing is different from what each person has experienced. But in fact, they're all describing something that is really and truly there. And it would take someone who could assimilate all of that, put all of that together, to really know the true nature of the elephant. Each worldview, according to Jain philosophy, reflects a perspective, a naya, on a complex or anekanta reality. The claims of all philosophies are therefore true, syat, in a certain sense or from a certain point of view, as I was explaining earlier. A nice contemporary example of this, sometimes the blind man and the elephant story is very charming, but it's got its issues too. In fact, there's a wonderful book by theologian John Tatamano where called Circling the Elephant, and he points out that uh, actual blind people have such refined senses, that they've so refined their other senses that they would probably not make this particular mistake. The story was certainly created by a sighted person. But someone who's used to relying on their sight, who was blindfolded, might very well fumble around with the elephant in the way described, and that might be a better way to think about the different worldviews. We're all blindfolded, right? We perceive that which we can perceive, but we've excluded something else through the lens that we've put over our consciousness that is our worldview. And using this idea of a lens, there's a very contemporary example which I like to use of Anekāntavāda. I was trying to explain multiple perspectives to my students once, and I came upon this image from the internet, and it's the Crab Nebula, a massive remnant of what used to be a star, thousands of light years away. And it's been viewed here through different wavelengths of light. So we have the radio, infrared, visible light, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays. And you can see it looks quite different through these. Some of them have some resemblance to each other, right? The first four, going from the left, radio through ultraviolet, there's kind of a structure there that you can recognize across those. But look at gamma rays. It looks totally different, right? It looks very, very different. X-rays, that looks quite different. Um, I'm fond of putting this picture up and then asking students, so which of these is the correct view of the Crab Nebula? And they usually get the answer right away. They're all correct, but none of them is complete, right? They all tell you something. Each of these pictures conveys true information about the Crab Nebula. Is any of them the whole story? Is any of the absolute truth of the Crab Nebula? No. To get that, you would have to combine them all, and you probably still wouldn't even have it then, because there's probably more things about the Crab Nebula that even we can't perceive just through observing it through light, right? So that there are other aspects as well. So reality is like the Crab Nebula. How does it look? Well, it depends on how you look at it. It depends on the lens you use. And if you think of your lens as your worldview or your perspective, your Naya, then that's going to give you a different appearance. One person's going to see something and see gamma rays. Someone else is going to look and see visible light. I'm using this as an analogy for how we all look at various issues in the world. In the contemporary period, many Jains see Anekāntavāda as an expression of intellectual ahimsa, an application of the principle of nonviolence to the realm of philosophical discourse. Now, many scholars have pointed out that that's not always been the case historically. True, but it's a living tradition, and a lot of Jains are really seeing Anekant and ahimsa as really interlinked concepts. This was the approach of the late Acharya Mahaprajna, pictured here, who saw Anekāntavāda as a synthesis of relative and absolute perspectives. His point of view shaped mine quite a bit. As I was working on my dissertation many years ago on Anekāntavāda, a book of his really I felt put it all together extremely well. What he means by synthesis of the relative and the absolute is that one is open to the truths of other points of view while yet affirming and rooting oneself in one's own understanding. That is, this isn't pure what's sometimes called relativism, right? This is why I like the term relativity, because it differentiates us from relative. Relativism is often applied to the idea that is everything is just thoroughgoingly relative, that there really is no truth, it's just all points of view. Absolutism, of course, is the opposite. Yes, there's a truth, there's a way things are. In Anekāntavāda and in Sadvada, we see the idea that there is a way things are, right? There is a definite Jain worldview, yet it is expansive enough to allow for many different perspectives that can all be partially true and can all contribute to the sum total knowledge of reality. So relativity has not meant that Jains have compromised on their commitment to ahimsa and the strictures it involves, especially for ascetic practitioners. The idea is not to give up on Jain principles, but to emphasize the ways in which those who hold other perspectives share points in common with the Jain tradition, rather than rejecting other views as completely false, right? Instead of looking for what you might see as the flaw, assuming difference is a flaw, and you see the difference in another view and you therefore reject it, you look for the common ground. And then you say, okay, this is true syat, right? This is true from a certain point of view. And there are good concrete examples of this because Jain philosophers engaged for many centuries with both Buddhist and what we now call Hindu thinkers. So, for example, Jain traditional thinkers have emphasized the principle of change affirmed by the Buddha and the principle of eternality beyond time and space affirmed by Shankara in the Advaita tradition. And the idea is that these are both true from a Jain perspective, which emphasizes both the changing aspect of entities and their unchanging eternal aspect. This is especially the case when you look at the nature of the jiva or the soul, which on the phenomenal level is undergoing the experience of its karmas, so it's constantly changing. Just as the Buddha said, our experience is a constantly changing flow. And yet there is a nature of the jiva, right? What Kunda Kundacharya called the samayasara, right? The nature of the soul that is eternal and unchanging, just like the Brahman of Advaita Vedanta affirmed by Shankara. So the Jain perspective says, well, we accept both, right? Even though these two views were often very much in conflict in ancient times, philosophical conflict. Now, critics argue that this way of thinking still puts the Jain tradition in a superior position as having a more complete or more comprehensive worldview. Right? Wilhelm Halbfass called it a panoramic coordinating inclusivism was his term for this. But it could also be argued that it's part of the logic of having a view at all, that one holds one's own view to be in some sense superior, or else we would abandon it, right? So the idea is not to say, well, I don't know anything, I'm just going to listen to what everyone else says. I am going to listen to what everyone else says, but I come to the table with a perspective, and I wouldn't have that perspective if I hadn't had certain life experiences, hadn't been persuaded by certain arguments, and so on. So we come with what we already believe we know. And that's inevitable. We don't need to take offense. If someone has a different view, by implication, they think they know something that you don't. Now, maybe they do, or maybe not. But the point is that simply the fact that they do that is not itself a violent or offensive thing. Just as Jains believing that we should all be vegetarian is not um, a bad thing. It's part of holding the Jain worldview. It's something we should expect, right, rather than take offense at that. But that doesn't mean we have to deride other points of view, right? The fact that we have a point of view doesn't mean we have to say, well, everyone who doesn't agree with me about this, they're bad people, they're ignorant, they're inferior. No, we're just talking about views, right? And we may prefer certain views. That doesn't mean we prefer the people who hold them necessarily. Maybe people with other views might have all kinds of other virtues, and we might enjoy their company very much and learn a great deal from them. So we can maintain our principles and still learn from others. But this is the opposite of polarization. Gandhi was a great example of this. He described himself, in fact, as an adherent of Anekāntavāda. For him, the doctrine was a pragmatic one, a matter of learning to view others with empathy. He says, formerly I used to resent the ignorance of my opponents. Today I can love them because I'm gifted with the eye to see myself as others see me, and vice versa. I want to take the whole world in the embrace of my love. So, could Anekāntavāda become a basis for a more compassionate way of communicating with those whose views differ from our own? Contemporary polarization is based on an insistence on the wrongness of the perspective of the other. While there are deep and genuine disagreements, however, we do all inhabit the same world, even if we're perceiving different facets of it or perceiving the same facets from different perspectives. The 8th century Jain philosopher Haribhadra Suri affirmed that Anekāntavāda was rooted in the Jain principle of metaphysical realism, the non-reductionist view that every aspect of our experiences is in some way rooted in reality. It's not simply to be dismissed as wholly illusory or false. At the same time, each aspect of our experience is limited, as is knowledge based on a point of view rooted in that aspect. So, to know reality till we become omniscient ourselves, we need to learn from others. If we apply this to our contemporary situation, it suggests acknowledging the validity of the experiences and perceptions of others, as well as the limitations in our own, while at the same time upholding the validity of our own point of view and gently inviting others to see beyond their limited perspectives. Some solution to the current situation would appear to be essential to human survival. I've been telling audiences this in various venues. I mentioned it when I was in India. I had the opportunity to speak at Delhi University. I said, as we waste our time fighting about who's right and who's wrong about various topics, our earth is getting hotter and we're having more and more problems connected with climate that we urgently need to address, and we're expending our energy fighting about other things. It's really foolishness on a cosmic scale. The hope behind this presentation is that an approach to difference rooted in Anekāntavāda, Nyayavada, and Syadvada can help lead humanity beyond its current predicament to a global society based on dialogue, openness, and mutual respect. Now, I want to add just before I close that this is a hope, but it's a cautious hope. Because, I mean, of course, the first question that I think of, if I were a listener to my own presentation, I'd say, but how are we going to get people to adopt this? Couldn't this become one more thing to be polarized about? Well, I believe in Anekāntavāda. Well, I don't. Well, then we can, have our fight. This seems to be something that invites a deeper engagement and really almost something like a spiritual practice where we for the purpose of compassion cultivate this way of learning and of speaking and of engaging with others, and in doing so become more compassionate, sharpen that practice of compassion, and hope that others will see its benefits and do the same. One can aspire to other things. Maybe some big institution will pick this up. Maybe the United Nations will start promoting Anekāntavāda. Maybe education systems will start promoting Anekāntavāda. I would be very much in favor of that. But I think this way of approaching topics of all kinds is really much more compassionate than what is currently the predominant norm. So I'm now open to questions, anything anyone would like to ask. And that is the conclusion of my formal remarks. And so I'm having a challenge stopping my screen sharing, but we could just leave it here or um, see what.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Long, for a wonderful presentation to kick us off here in the Compassion Studies Initiative. I can try, Diana, my co-host, may be able to stop your screen share. I can ask Diana to give that a shot. And while she's trying to do that, it also looks wonderful with an image of you here with your question slide. So in any case, I think it will work. And we do have some questions coming in. And so I also have some questions, but let's see how much time we have here. There we go. Thank you, Diana.
All right.
So yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Long. So Jonathan Dickstein, a member here at Arihanta Institute, one of our colleagues, says, thank you, Dr. Long, for this wonderful exploration. While a common and perhaps predictable question, how does this perspective translate into action, particularly if and when one is confronted with alternative views that threaten the actual material lives of marginalized groups and individuals, and by individuals who are not interested in quote unquote mutual respect, as you're describing it here?
Right, right. That's an extremely difficult question, and I think that this approach is not a cure-all necessarily. And we know that in the Jain tradition, even given its very strong emphasis on ahimsa paramo dharma, right, is ahimsa is the highest duty, and yet, we know that there were Jain kings historically who had armies and who engaged in warfare and who engaged in policing of their citizenry. And the understanding is that not all jivas, not all souls have sort of reached the point where they understand that it's in their own self-interest not to inflict harm, not to exploit, not to marginalize. And because of that, we end up with the necessity of things like the state, things like militaries and so forth, with the understanding that all of this should be employed with the aim of maximizing nonviolence, right? The aim of maximizing compassion. This, is of course where things become difficult because it's not always the case that those who are empowered with these very important tools in society are themselves virtuous, right? That when you have corrupt kings or when you have someone who's a psychopath who takes up a profession where they can enjoy inflicting violence with impunity, right? That this is the difficulty of samsara. And I think this is one thing that the Jain tradition, along with the Buddhist and Hindu traditions, emphasizes, which is that our aim is really not to perfect the world, ultimately to become free from it, to become liberated from it. Now, many Jain thinkers, and also in the modern period, we see Hindu and Buddhist thinkers like Thich Nhat Hanh, Swami Vivekananda. In the Jain tradition, Acharya Chandaniji, Acharya Tulsi, they are saying, the effort to make the world better itself is a spiritually purifying practice, and it's something that we need to engage in. But I think we would be naive if we believed that ideas alone would be sufficient to transform society. That tragically, there is this necessity of force. And I don't even like saying that because I think it opens up, as often called, the slippery slope problem, right? One can assent intellectually to the idea that it may sometimes be necessary to inflict suffering to prevent greater suffering. But that logic was the same logic that President Harry Truman used when he decided to drop atomic bombs on two Japanese cities. Something which I personally think was not actually warranted by the situation. Of course, I wasn't Harry Truman, or maybe I was in another life. I don't know. But I can't. I haven't stood in his shoes. But just from looking at history, it seems like a big motive in dropping the bombs was also to, in a sense, signal to the rest of the world, especially the Soviet Union, that we have this now. That there was so much devastation. If you go, as I've done many times, if you've been to Hiroshima, go to the Peace Museum, you see the belongings, you see the lunchbox of the little boy who was on his way to school and it melted, when the bomb hit. And I don't think anything would justifies the loss of that life, really anything at all. And yet we end up in these messy calculations when we start thinking, well, how do we stop greater harm? We certainly don't want to be passive. Even Mahatma Gandhi was opposed to that. There's often a caricature of Mahatma Gandhi that he opposed violence in all times, in all places, and under all conditions. But he understood the necessity of a police force. He understood the necessity of a military. But these things need to all occur under the ethos of ahimsa and compassion. And that's, I think, our challenge to really sort of purify our institutions and our society, our tendency to marginalize, to treat certain people as other and cast them aside. And of course, that begins with purifying, I think, ourselves on the individual level. There are things we need to do on the social and structural level, but I think we, each of us, need to be dedicating ourselves to this each day. So I think Anekāntavāda can be a very important and helpful tool. I use the phrase antidote in my called the antidote to polarization. Having recently been in the process of recovering from an illness, I'll say it's one of the medicines that we need to bring about a cure for the world. But I don't think it's the only one, and I don't think it's alone sufficient. Just as when you're taking a medicine, you also need to maintain a good diet and get exercise and all of those things. So, um, but that is a very good question.
Yes, and thank you for your very honest and kind of balanced, grounded answer there, Professor Long. Very characteristic of your teaching approach and your pedagogy, and we truly appreciate that. And the next question, actually, from our other colleague, Hope Bohanec at Compassionate Living, continues with this theme of really a kind of applied or engaged form of Anekāntavāda. So how does Anekāntavāda compare with the modern practice of nonviolent communication? Is there some kind of overlap there that you want to talk about?
I think there is an overlap. I think when we think of nonviolent communication, and I mean, and you very kindly characterized my reply just now to the previous question as balanced, and I'm grateful to hear that. I try to use this in my life, right? Anekāntavāda has really shaped the way I present things, the way I talk about topics, the way I approach questions. And I do see it as a form of nonviolent speech that and again and because it was something that Acharya Sagaji emphasized so much in my recent conversation with him, the importance of silence, the importance of listening as part of compassionate speech. You know, when we think of compassionate speech, the first thing we think about is, well, what should I say in situation X? It's also, I think, very smart to start thinking about, when should I not say anything at all? You know, when is silence the appropriate response? And I think this is a big part of compassionate speech as well. And there was an article that I read. I'm blanking on the name of the author, but it's one of the assigned readings in the compassion course I recently developed, talking about how it actually connecting this with another Jain concept of aparigraha, or non-attachment, that if we're willing to cede or give over the time in the conversation to the other person and let them speak, that's a form of compassion. And that also is listening. And that, according to Acharya Sagaji, is that fourth level of truth that Syadvada includes. So I think Anekāntavāda, for me, what it provides is, and not everyone thinks this way, but I'm trained in philosophy. So you've got a justification, right? You've got a worldview in terms of which that compassionate way of speaking makes sense. Now, it's not that you have to have that before you can start speaking compassionately. Hopefully, we just sort of feel that on some level, that compassion. But we also, you know, we're rational beings, and we think about things, and we want to understand, okay, why do so many people think so differently from each other? Why is there something about the universe itself that lends itself to these multiple views? And I think what the Jain tradition very powerfully offers is an account that says, yes, it's the diversity is built into the nature of the cosmos itself. And so and built is a not a great word to use when you're talking about a tradition that has no creator deity, but it's there, right? Or we're building or sustaining that all the time with our interdependence.
Wonderful. That's a perfect word to end that question, interdependence. And I say that because the next two questions, following off of Hope Bohanec's questions there from Mary Mackey and Jennifer J, have to do with crossing over the species barrier with this tool, right? And so maybe I just try to briefly summarize that it looks like they're both involved in various forms of animal advocacy and also things that relate to that and the environment and the effect it had on the environment and the animals. And how can you use this as a tool, Anekāntavāda, so to speak? How can you use this as a tool to deal with the kind of confrontations and conversations that you have in a way that is, on the one hand, effective, and on the other hand, peaceful at the same time?
Oh, absolutely. I think this is very, very urgent, in fact. And what we often find when we do encounter polarization over things like climate change or how we treat animals, how we treat other animals, right? Other living beings on the planet. Um, of course, you get all kinds of, noise sometimes thrown into the conversation. But if you look at it from a Jain perspective, if you sort of pare each perspective down to its core, um, perspective, its core focus, what you'll often find is the ecology being pitted against the economy. That there is an assumption among those who are resistant to more compassion, more concern for animals, more concern for the environment. There's an assumption that that means that they are not going to live as comfortably, that they're going to lose something in their lifestyle and in their way of living that's very important to them. And they might even lose their livelihood itself, right? And I think of coal miners in my home state of Pennsylvania, right? Coal mining has causes all kinds of environmental problems. Um, and if we're stuck in the mode of polarization, what we will instinctively want to do is say to those people, well, you need to think of something besides yourself. You're being selfish. Look at all of the destruction that's happening if you keep doing what you're doing. And guess how effective that is in persuading those people? They become even more hardened, right? And in fact, it kind of, you might even drive the idea that, you know, these environmentalists don't even care about the environment. They just want to destroy our way of life. And when you get this whole crazy discourse, right, it just goes off the rails. If we approach this from an Anekāntavāda perspective, I think what we would do would be to say, I hear you. It's scary. You've been making your living in a certain way for generations, and the idea that that whole thing is built on a wrong foundation is it's disruptive, it's disconcerting. Uh, it seems to involve a moral judgment, but if you didn't know all those years that what you were doing was harmful, it's not a moral judgment. But look, we have this evidence that what you're doing is problematic. So then I think we have those of us on maybe more on the environmentalist side have an obligation to say, well, let's look at other technologies and other things we can do and other ways of doing things where you could have as good or better a way of life. I mean, from a purely material perspective than what you've been doing. Wouldn't it be nice to not be in the danger of cave-ins and black lung all the time? Wouldn't it be great to work up in the open air and, you know, be installing solar panels or maintaining windmills or something like that? I you'd still there'd still be a persuasive case you'd have to make, but you would be signaling that you are hearing the root concern of the other person, that there's a way of life that is in danger, there is a way of doing things that is in danger, and there's a livelihood itself that's in danger. And you have to address that and compassionately. And then those people become, they join you, right? They say, especially once the process begins, once you get more green jobs out there. Well, these are better paying than what we were doing, and they're less dangerous. That's great. So let's embrace that. Let's move forward with that. And I think another thing too that happens in polarization is culture itself starts to be deployed as a weapon. So I uh, I did a really goofy thing once, and it was kind of silly, but my students got the point. And I don't use the classroom as a political platform, but a lot of what I talk about obviously has political implications. And I got the vibe, I got the sense that there were students that were maybe starting to feel a little alienated because they came from, again, a very different background and understanding. So I've got this flannel jacket. Looks like what a lumberjack would wear. And I've got this flannel jacket and a cowboy hat, which someone gave to me years ago. I hardly ever wear it. And one day I came to class wearing my cowboy hat and my flannel jacket. I didn't say a word. I just taught like I normally did. But it kind of sent a message. Like I had some of those students that were kind of more alienated were like, that was cool. Like, I mean, one guy in fact said, I really listened today for the first time, which was kind of disturbing. But finding ways to break through these walls that we build for ourselves, sometimes around issues that are really fundamental, like ecology and economy. We need both to survive, clearly. My perspective is ecology is more fundamental. Everything is built on that. If you don't have an earth, you can't do anything. But that oughtn't lead us to be dismissive of the concerns of these other folks. So I think that would be kind of an Anekāntavāda approach to that.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I know the human to human compassion is really what's the emphasis of the Compassion Studies Initiative in particular. Although we do, of course, have the Vegan Studies Initiative, which also focuses on human compassion and non-human compassion, all kind of wrapped into one. Here, we're really focusing on human to human compassion. But of course, we want to address all these questions, and I think these are great questions, and I appreciate your robust answer. Maybe to finish off the event, we have a few more minutes left. Another attendee has asked a question, kind of speaking to our current political moment in terms of everything that's happened over the last day. In fact, it's kind of, I don't want to say auspicious, but we're launching today on a very difficult day, politically speaking, all through the world.
Yeah,
And so this question really asks back to Professor Dickstein's previous question. Um, if in the U.S. president's first day in office yesterday, he signed executive orders once again disavowing the Paris Accord, negating the humanity of trans people, and promising to remove rights from them, beginning to militarize the borders. What specific philosophical, spiritual, or engaged behaviors does a human being who is relatively safe from political threats ensure that Anekāntavāda is not simply a way to kind of lapse into a way of being non-engaged, form of non.
right, right. That is a fantastic question. Fantastic question. And I really think it obligates us to put a lot of effort in on the local level because we're not the president, right? That's only one person at a time. And now I might be, I might just be reassuring myself here. In what I'm about to say. I did read a piece today suggesting that a lot of these executive orders are air, right? One of them is blatantly unconstitutional. It can't be implemented without like three-fourths of Congress changing the Constitution. And others are almost impossible to implement or, will face considerable legal challenges. I think, again, what we need to do is mobilize people such that they start to feel this compassion. They start to understand that trans people are human beings. They start to understand that the Paris Accords are actually good for everybody. And I don't think we do that by wagging our finger and telling them they're bad people. I think we try to, okay, what are the fears? I suspect behind a lot of the fear of trans people is people's insecurity about their own sexuality and their own body and their own mind and space. Which, by the way, the Jain tradition has very interesting things to say about, right, guys? Because of all these conversations about gender, about dravya and bhava, right? The gender of the body, the gender of the mind. All of this is discussed very thoroughly in Jain traditions, and sort of addressing those insecurities when we encounter them in the people in our lives and in our communities. And a lot of hatred originally comes from fear, and fear comes from ignorance. So sharing knowledge with people in a non condescending way and you know connecting with and getting to know people well, often through other things, right? Maybe unrelated, like someone might become good friends with you because they like a certain TV series that you like, or a certain music that you like. Maybe you work out at the same gym, and as you find you have a bond, then you might find, well, you have differences on some of these other issues, and that's a real opportunity to explore. And instead of just jumping in right away and saying, well, I think you're wrong about that, say, so why do you think that? And you might get a whole narrative about their life that can evoke a lot of compassion, but with which you could work to gently bring them in a different direction. You say, I've had a very different set of experiences, and I see this. And so yeah, that whole idea of, it's become a cliche now, but think globally, act locally. I think there's going to be a lot of that in the coming months and years of the new administration, that we're going to have to all work with our particular networks locally and even person to person, as well as whatever we can do to impact the wider society. Because all this top-down stuff, we really don't have a lot of power over. We're stuck with it at the moment.
Well, thank you, Professor Long. That's a difficult question to ask at a difficult time in what we're all going through, and I appreciate your kind of honesty and balanced approach once again, and kind of it's very pragmatic, I guess, the response you've given us there, and so I really commend you and thank you for that. It's so interesting how Anekāntavāda, as you've shown it and as you described in your presentation, has gone and become something that it wasn't before, but is adapting to new uses. And I was really touched as well in your presentation by the story of the Digambar Muni, who emphasized silence. And as you said, sometimes in the face of some of these things, it doesn't mean silence in the sense, but it's an active silence that is a kind of regrouping and rebuilding in order to have an appropriate response to what is happening all around us. So I thank you for sharing that as well, because this is compassion in action, and the silence doesn't have to be a retreat. It might just be a pause.
Right. Not the silence of complicity, but of listening. Yeah.
Not complicity, but listening. That's a perfect way I think, to end it. So I want to thank you so much for launching our Compassion Studies Voices in Compassion Studies speaker series, and for offering your course to us, which will be coming out at the very beginning of February, so people can keep an eye out for that. And Professor Long has taught other courses with us and is a beloved member of our affiliated faculty. So we thank you so much there in Pennsylvania, Professor Long. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Diana Hulit, who is going to share a few closing announcements. Jajinder, thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Professor Long. It's been an absolute joy to practice listening with your presentation. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today for our first Voices in Compassion Studies presentation with Dr. Long. We look forward to seeing you next time. I have dropped the registration for Professor Venu Mehta's talk, which will be coming up on February 18th at 9 a.m. Pacific time, which is Forgiveness in the Jain View, the Interplay of Righteousness, Compassion, and Ethical Choice. Also, please make sure you save the date for our Compassion in Action Earth Day conference, which is on April 19th and 20th. We have an outstanding lineup of presenters and also look forward to seeing you there. So stay tuned on our website, also perhaps on our social media feeds for updates and any details on registration. So all our best to you. May we continue to navigate the path with compassion and deep listening and silence when appropriate, engaging the practice of Anekāntavāda as we move through our respective lives. Until next time, thank you again.
Jai Jinendra.